if you are planning on a webinar called Building Real Commitment and Consensus for Change, Will and Skill with Dr. Anthony Muhammad, then you are in the right place. And we welcome you in joining us today. I will apologize about the color on my camera. Apparently my video isn't working exactly like I would hope, but it's not me you came to see, so when Dr. Muhammad gets on, hopefully it'll be a lot better. As we begin today, there's a few things that I'd like to get started with, just a little bit about me. 20 years in public education, classroom teacher, administrator, state level coordinator of school improvement initiatives. I love education, and luckily when I was an educator, I got to know Solution Tree and authors at Solution Tree like Dr. Muhammad, and it made such a difference in what was happening for my teachers and for my teachers and for the schools in which I was working. So you're in for a real treat this afternoon. Here's some tips that you might want to know about today's presentation that might help you just a little bit. You have a chat dialog box that you have access to, and so if you have any technical questions, please send them to the user named host. There's a list that there's a lot of things to do, and you can look through there and find hosts. You will be placed on mute during the webinar, and every once in a while you might hear a voice because it takes a little while to get some of that adjusted, but once we get started, that will be mute. So if you have any questions, type your content-related questions in that chat dialog box and send, once again, the question to the user named host Solution Tree. And we will collect all your questions while Dr. Muhammad is speaking and actually have some time to ask those and answer those later on in the presentation. We'll get to as many of them as we can possibly get to, but many times there are more questions than we have time for, but we'll do our very best to answer your questions because we want to be here for you. The webinar recording and handouts will be available, and there's a website right there that you can go to for 60 days, and you'll also receive an email link reminding you that that's something that you might want to have access to. And then, without any further ado, here's some information on Dr. Muhammad. He has been such a leader in school change and working with what really makes a difference in schools, both from a professional learning community's perspective and then in his own authorship with understanding the dynamics of human nature and how that impacts school and change and makes a difference for everybody. He is a nationally known speaker that is just, he changes lives. I've been honored to be able to hear him and watch him and work with schools that he's made a difference in, and it will just be a wonderful hour this afternoon for you to listen and learn. So without any further ado, it is really my pleasure to introduce to you, I'm sorry, I said without any further ado, but I do want to say just a little bit about Solution Tree, because Solution Tree is putting this on. And for those of you that are new to Solution Tree, I just want to tell you a little bit about it. The Solution Tree has really three different things that impact education. One are their in-demand events. We have institutes and conferences all over the nation and actually internationally. If you're interested at all, you'll see the website on here a lot that you can have access to and find those things that are most relevant to you. Obviously, we have text resources that you can have access to, and I'll speak a little bit later about Anthony's book and how that can support you in your work. And then we have professional development. And once again, Dr. Muhammad is an excellent presenter to come into your schools and your districts. He's got associates that work with him, and we can get those people into your districts to help you make the change that you want to have happen for your district. But now, without any further ado, I will introduce you to Dr. Anthony Muhammad.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate your introduction, and I appreciate all of the folks who have taken some time out of their busy schedule to join us for this webinar today. And I'm assuming that everybody who was on the webinar today is interested in improving the lives of the students that they serve, whether at the leadership capacity or whether at the classroom level. And we're really involved in some very exciting work. I do want to thank everybody who's logged on to this webinar today. and thank you for what you do for young people on a daily basis. And our topic that we're really going to deal today with deals with school culture. And it's really a snippet from an upcoming book that I am writing with Dr. Shiraki Holly. We make the argument that in order to have a truly effective school, there has to be a mix of what we call will and skill. And will deals with school culture, and skill deals with that ability to actually take those strategies that we know work and actually use them. So it's a combination of both. And the area that I'm going to focus on today is one that hasn't gotten the attention that I think that it deserves, because culture or will is something that has to be cultivated or developed. So I want to lay a case first and then get into how do we methodically develop healthy cultures at every school. Because if you don't have a healthy culture, I don't care how many resources you have, I don't care how many people come and speak at your school, if the staff and the educators at that school are not focused and on the same page, those strategies will have a very low likelihood of being successful. So I want to start with, what are we all about? What are we trying to accomplish? What is the purpose of the public school system? Now, this comes right out of the book Tinkering Towards Utopia, that there's really two basic principles that the public school lies on. It's the fact or the belief that all children have the right to have their gifts and talents cultivated through the process of education, that education is not just a privilege, it's a right, and that's why we have a public school system.
Right.
And secondly, that all students can learn and become educated. Those are the two assumptions that public schools are where the foundation for public schools lie, and that really gives us a direction for our work. Now, I'm trying to get my slide to advance. Okay, there we go. All right. Now, many of you will travel to Phoenix, Arizona for the purpose of developing a professional learning community. And I think Rick DeForest said it very well. The purpose of professional learning communities isn't for you to learn how to become a professional learning community. The purpose is to use professional learning communities to address the real need of the school, which is to educate students and that students have very high learning outcomes. So what is a PLC? What are you coming to Phoenix to learn how to do? Rick DeForest, Bob Baker, and Becky DeForest define it like this. A professional learning community is a group of educators committed to working collaboratively in ongoing processes of collective inquiry and action research in order to achieve better results for the students they serve. They also go on to say that PLCs operate under the assumption that the key to improved learning for students is continuous job-embedded learning for educators. So we're talking about developing an environment that focuses on student learning, and that there are certain skills or processes that people will undergo in order to reach the ends of that organization, which is a school, which we say is student learning. So how do we make that happen? Now, I think most of us would, if we analyzed our current situations and we were perfectly honest, we'd probably say we don't meet the criterion for professional learning community 100%. So Albert Einstein, one of the brightest minds of the 20th century, said, insanity is to do the same thing over and over and expect a different result. So if the criteria for being a professional learning community is not what we actually practice today, that means in order to improve our results, we have to change. And this is where sociology is introduced. Why is sociology important? We're talking about the will. One thing that politicians and some researchers forget is that school is a human enterprise. We're not talking about robots or technology. We're talking about human beings who have emotions, who have psychology. So as much as we develop our curriculum, we have to methodically develop our culture. So will development or sociology, what is sociology? It's the science of social relations, organizations, and change. So how do we get the people aligned to do the work that needs to be done, which is the education of children? Now, there are two forms of change in organizations. One we call technical or structural, the skill component, and the other we call cultural, or the will component. In the history of educational reform, we've always been very heavy on the technical or the structural. Many of the latest school reforms that have been introduced have been about changing the structure, changing the curriculum, changing the technology, and definitely these things are very important. But if we don't get the human beings aligned, don't be shocked if those new structures, those new tools don't work. So we're going to focus on the will this afternoon. Now, my argument is, and my colleague's argument is that we need a balance of the two. As much emphasis as we place on structure, we also have to methodically develop and place emphasis on the culture, and that productive schools have a balance of both. Now, what we're shooting for and what hopefully we can help produce in every school in America and across the world is a school that has high will and high skill. And what do we mean by that? That here's a group of faculty members who believe that their students can learn, and their efforts and their belief is focused in that area. And they seek and implement practices, strategies, and structures that actually develop that social or that collective end. So high belief and high skill. And we see schools operate in all four of the continuums: low skill and high will, low will and low skill, and also low skill and high will. What we're trying to shoot for are schools that have the belief as well as the practice to back their belief. Now, how do we define school culture? If we're talking about developing, or as my book points to, transforming school culture, it's important to really get a solid idea of what school culture is. According to Kent Peterson out of University of Wisconsin, school culture is a set of norms, values, and beliefs, rituals and ceremonies, symbols and stories that make up what Peterson calls the persona of the school. So it is not one individual component. It's all of these components together. School culture are the make up the norms, the values, the practices, the beliefs that makes up the total package, which is called the persona. Now, this framework is kind of like a skeleton without meat, so we're going to put a little meat on those bones. This is the type of culture that we're trying to eliminate. This is the antithesis of what we're trying to produce. It's called a toxic school culture. What is a toxic school culture? Peterson describes it like this. It is a place where educators believe that student success is based solely upon a student's level of concern, attentiveness, prior knowledge, and willingness to comply with the demands of school. And they articulate that belief in overt and covert ways. I'm going to stop and pause for just a second. If you take a look at the first part of this definition, here's a school who says that student success has some prerequisites. There are some variables or some conditions that students have to meet, and those are the students have to walk into the door concerned, attentive, with background knowledge, and have to do exactly what we tell them in order to be successful. So, I don't think any teacher in America or across the world would argue that they would love to have a classroom full of students who cared, who paid attention, whose parents read to them when they were small, and they did everything that they were told. That would be the dream class. But we are very aware that every student does not walk in predisposed to those characteristics. So, a toxic culture places all of the stress and emphasis or the pressure for success on the shoulders of children. You can't find a successful business anywhere that places all of the pressure and stress for gaining a profit on the shoulders of their clients. Healthy or good businesses figure out how they can serve and attract clients so that they can make a profit. A toxic culture places all of the blame for success or failure, or the responsibility, on the success of their clients, which are the students. And that's probably not a good way to get higher achievement in a school. So in a toxic culture, they develop what I call a culture of deflection and description. They spend all of their time describing the problem and deflecting blame on their clients. And they develop a communication system, which I'll address a little bit later. Now, toxic cultures just aren't happy to be toxic mentally, or to have a toxic mentality or paradigm. They develop toxic policies, toxic procedures, and toxic practices. So a toxic culture is not just toxic philosophically. They also become toxic in their practice. This is the type of culture we're trying to eliminate. Now, next slide. All right. For some reason my slide's not advancing. Can you give me some help on the slide?
Yeah, Dr. Muhammad, click
yes.
on the slide area with your mouse.
Mm-hmm.
And try it again.
Okay. All right. Now, as I described earlier, toxic cultures become what we call descriptive and deflective. They spend all of their time describing the issues that they find unsavory. So they'll tell you everything is wrong. And what's really interesting about a toxic culture is that they almost become scientists at it. They become very good at telling you every reason why they haven't reached their goals, and they don't have a problem telling you who's responsible. And what's interesting is that those who do the describing are rarely, if ever, the ones who they identify as being responsible. So they end up being descriptive and deflective, and they become what Rick DeFore calls a culture that does a good job looking out of a window, but they don't do a very good job looking in a mirror. And I'm going to describe later why that's not good practice. This leads to a phenomena that I describe as adult drama. And I'm sure a lot of you out there who are listening to this webinar may be dealing with some adult drama. And we've always seen it, but I'm for the first time going to put an operationalized definition on it. What is adult drama? What is this garbage that we deal with on a daily basis as it pertains to the dysfunction of adults? So what is adult drama? It's a dysfunctional social interaction between adult professionals within a school environment that interfere with the proper implementation of important policies, practices, and procedures that support the proper education of students. Say that one more time. It's dysfunctional social interactions between adult professionals within a school environment that interfere with the proper implementation of important policies, practices, and procedures that support the overall development and education of students. We all have experienced this, and this is an issue that can't be legislated from Washington. It can't be legislated from your state capitol. This is something that only we as professionals can deal with and handle. We've allowed unprofessionalism to take an unhealthy place in our professional culture, and we have to look at the development of that unhealthy behavior and also look at ways to eliminate that unhealthy behavior. Now, when a school becomes absolutely toxic, they become what we call they develop what's called a cycle of blame, where the administrators blame the teachers blame the administrators, and as both parties are being very accurate in their description of the other party's dysfunction, they refuse to look at themselves in the mirror and ask, what's going on? There's a recipe for disaster that leads to this, and you can see this in the cycle, but I want to break this down and simplify it for you. You're really looking at three what we call predeterminations of areas that lead to this cycle of blame and this total dysfunction. The first area is inappropriate preparation. Inappropriate preparation. There are educators who have been placed in positions where they have not been totally cultivated or developed to be able to adequately handle the job responsibilities of that position. I know that universities and teacher education programs and administrator prep programs do the best they can to simulate the conditions that educators will inherit when they go and practice in the field. But we all know that what we learn at a university doesn't really even come close to preparing us for what we inherit. So you have the combination of poor preparation coupled with poor support systems. One of my passions is to work with administrators to not just analyze the behavior of their teachers or analyze the productivity of their teachers, but analyze, are those teachers getting the support that they need to do the job they're being asked to do? Do they know how to do the job? Do they have the training to do what they're being asked to do? And do they also have the resources necessary to do what they're being asked to do? So we couple inappropriate preparation, poor support, and the last piece we look at is called task overload. Are people being asked to do more than what is reasonable? Because there are some schools that have so many issues that they have to deal with, and the anxiety level increases because they're getting pressure from the state, pressure from central office, pressure from the board, and pressure being added to low capacity and poor support systems is what I call a recipe for disaster. That leads to defense mechanisms, and it leads to a polarization among groups to protect their psyche from all of the byproducts of inappropriate preparation, poor support systems, and task overload. So these toxic cultures are really just responses from the environment. Now, why do toxic cultures become deflective? Why do they spend all their time deflecting? In a book written by a French researcher named Dublé, in a book called The Stress Myth, that deflection and blame are defense mechanisms developed out of a need to be in control. The feeling of control is actually counterproductive because it does not adequately prepare people to deal with the uncertain situations that are sure to arrive out of the course of daily life and in practice. It is better for a staff to be prepared as opposed to being in control. So I want to backtrack for a minute. When people start to deflect, they're venting, and they create what we're going to get into a little bit later called the culture of complaint. That when people get highly frustrated, they seek to identify with a group who are equally as frustrated, and they create these subcultures. Many of you have either been a part of that subculture or have suffered because of the effect and influence of that subculture. That need to deflect in human behavior comes out of our need to be in control. Freud taught us about the ego and the superego, that people have a need to be in control. They have a need to understand and to feel like they're adequate. When they're placed in a frustrating situation where their environment may send them a different message than the message of being adequate or being in control, they evoke what are called defense mechanisms. One of the defense mechanisms that they use is called deflection. So whenever we're placed as human beings in a light where we're looked at like we're not adequate, we haven't made AYP, we're in program improvement, the superintendent or the board isn't happy, or parents aren't happy, it is natural for people to seek defense mechanisms to protect themselves psychologically. So what people don't realize is that defense mechanism actually makes it more difficult for them to reach the success that has been elusive. The need for us to be in control really hinders our ability to develop a better mindset, which is a mindset of being prepared. Being prepared means it recognizes that we can't be in control. So those teachers who are frustrated, administrators who are frustrated, there's nothing we can do about parents who don't reinforce the values that we want students to have when they come to school. We can't go into their home and change that. We can't change some of the policies of the federal government. We can't change certain economic realities in our community. We can't change certain structural elements. But what we can do is we can be prepared for the uncertainty and some of the challenges that those variables cause. So a big issue, administrators who are listening, a big area of focus with the staff to make sure that they become healthy is to sell the mentality that it is better for us to be prepared rather than seeking to be in control. The need to be in control leads to punitive policies, supporting bad practices, reinforcing destructive traditions, because we have this need to be in control. In the new book that I've just finished, go into things like dress code. That's a need to be in control rather than to be prepared for the obstacles that students might bring to school with them. Now, okay, we go. Now, that's what causes a toxic culture. Now, what are we trying to develop? We're trying to develop what Peterson calls a healthy school culture. And I want to give you a metaphor for this term healthy or healthy school culture. I like you to think about school culture like soil in a garden. So if any of the listeners or anybody who's logged on to this webinar has a garden, I like for you to think about culture like your garden. And if anybody has a garden, you know how important soil is to your garden. Think about culture like soil. And I like you to think about technical change or policy or procedure change like seeds. We all know that you can go to the farmer's market and you can buy the best seeds that money can buy. You can buy the top-of-the-line seeds. But if you bring those seeds back and you plant them in an environment or you plant them in soil that is dry, acidic, and uncultivated, Don't be shocked if that seed doesn't grow. This has been the frustration of schools and districts all over the country, especially in the area of leadership. Leadership will go to seminars, they will go to workshops, and will bring back a lot of good technical change. And it becomes frustrating because all of this investment, when placed in a toxic soil or toxic culture, doesn't render that school to be any more effective than they were before. So this is why I am on the bullhorn, I am on the soapbox, emphasizing the development, methodical development of healthy culture. We are spending too much time and too much money on technical and ignoring the cultural issues that undermine our ability to help every child be successful. So what does this healthy soil of culture look like? This is how Kent Peterson describes it. He describes healthy culture as a place where educators have an unwavering belief in the ability of all of their students to achieve success, and they pass that belief on to others in overt and covert ways. I'm going to stop right here. The first level of alignment that we know that has to be cultivated in a healthy school culture is the universal belief that all students can learn. Now, we would be foolish to think that everyone who interacts with our students, everybody who teaches our students or counsels our students or advises our students, all believe that every single child that they serve can be successful. We would be foolish, naive, and would be burying our head in the sand to assume that everybody, based upon their difference in socialization, their difference in background, their difference in political persuasion, religious persuasion, their difference in just how they view the universe, to believe that everyone sees our kids the same is naive. I think that's taking optimism to a level that it doesn't deserve. There are some people who develop some stereotypes, who develop some assumptions about kids that, if not challenged, will manifest itself in their practice. So the first area of cultivation in a healthy school culture is the universal belief that all kids can learn. Now, what we may get when we try and cultivate this belief system is that some of our naysayers may say, well, it's impossible for all kids to learn. Well, they may not have experienced it, but Benjamin Bloom's research on cognition would say otherwise. But we're not saying that when we develop a universal belief that all kids can learn, that at this point we even know how to do it. If any of the folks who've logged into this webinar are coaches, you know the importance of belief. If you coach a team that doesn't believe that they can win, don't be shocked if it affects their performance when they go on the field or on the court. The first thing that has to be developed is that the people who are there to serve in your school have an unwavering belief that all their kids can learn. That has to be cultivated. And the second part of this definition says educators create policies and procedures and adopt practices that support their belief in the ability of every student. So a healthy school culture is more than just rhetoric. That would be a high will, low skill school. To be a healthy culture, your will has to match your skill. What you say has to be buttressed by what you say you believe. So you won't be a healthy culture by holding hands in the parking lot and singing Kumbaya. That's a nice start. But do your homework policies reflect your belief in the ability of every student? Do your instructional policies, do your curriculum policies support the belief in every kid? Do your parent involvement procedures and policies support this belief? So being a healthy culture goes beyond simple belief, but goes deeply into policies, practices, and procedures. Together, this sounds like a professional learning community to me. This sounds like a place where students can be successful regardless of their outside school preparation. Now, if toxic cultures are descriptive and deflective, they spend all of their time describing problems and deflecting blame. What does a healthy culture look like? They're the complete opposite. If a toxic culture is descriptive, a healthy culture is what we call prescriptive. This would be being prepared as opposed to being in control. None of us can control what condition our students walk in with, but a healthy culture finds it to be a better use of their time to focus on helping kids who don't come in prepared rather than complaining and deflecting blame for kids who aren't prepared. So what you want to help your staff to develop is a collective efficacy where it doesn't make any difference what the problem is, whether it's attendance, whether it's parent involvement, whether it's school violence, whether it's low literacy, that these are things that we can't control from the outside in, but we can be prepared to influence once our students walk in. Just like in a toxic culture, in a healthy culture, this can be methodically developed. The first thing we have to get is universal commitment, a belief in all students. Our school goals have to guide our behavior. So the goal of a public school or private school is the education of every child. That has to supersede the needs of the adults. You can't find an effective organization anywhere on the planet where the needs of the employees supersede the needs of the clients. And if you look at public service, police officers act based upon the public interest. And unfortunately, many of those brave public servants lose their life in protecting the public. Firefighters put the public best interest first. Education is one of the few areas that we find where in some cases the needs of the public servant becomes more important than the need of those that they serve. So the first thing that has to be developed is a universal commitment to those that we serve. The next part is that we have to be reflective. Jim Collins calls this confronting brutal facts. How are we doing in relationship to what we say our goal is? Are we actually educating every child? And if there are some obstacles to educating every child, how do we actually develop that? So how do we get closer to, I guess the person calling didn't know we were doing a webinar, so I apologize for that. In a healthy culture, a leader will walk their staff through, okay, if we all agree our primary purpose is to help kids learn, how are we doing currently in relationship to that goal? That's being reflective. If you look at it from a medical terminology, it's called diagnosing. What's going on? Our goal is for patients to be healthy. We look at the patient's data, we find the patient isn't healthy, and from that diagnosis comes a prescription. How do we prescribe? Discipline, practice, and collaboration. So it's about helping your staff develop a collective commitment, be honest enough to reflect on their current practice, and then look for practices or remedies that are different than those who've led us down this road in the past, and focusing on practice, which is the skill part, to help us reach the goal of our commitment, which is the development of all of our students. Now, the real difference between a healthy and a toxic culture looks like this. A toxic culture seeks to be in control. They act off of an illusion that anything that doesn't go right isn't our fault, and they will spend all of their time overly flabbergasted, overly angry, and upset about anything that is thrown their way, and their job is to soothe egos. They can be called a culture of complainers. They spend all of their time deflecting and describing, where a healthy culture focuses on being prepared. How do we get everybody on the bus, as Collins talked about, in the right seats, moving in the right direction? They find it a better use of their time to look in a mirror and cultivate the skills necessary to help every child develop and to help every child move forward. So if a toxic culture is a culture that needs to be in control and spends their time deflecting and describing, a healthy culture would be considered a group of problem solvers. We can never control problems. I know there's a saying that the only two sure things in life are death and taxes. I want to add one more to that. There's another sure thing that you can count on, and they're problems. No organization that I've ever been a part of or ever witnessed, evaluated, researched, every organization I've ever come in contact with has problems. You will never get away from problems. What separates a healthy culture from a toxic culture is that a toxic culture is happy describing why they're not effective and assigning blame, while a healthy culture is focused on how do we become prescriptive and solve the problems of our times here. Not healthy or healthy or toxic based upon how many problems you have. You're healthy or toxic based upon your collective ability to come together and solve your problems. And this is what really separates those effective schools who make breakthroughs and change lives, and those schools who are mired in status quo, who can't change no matter how much federal money they get, how much state money in the mud. They're frustrated, they're upset, and they can't move forward. And that's the real difference between the two. Now, at this point, I wanted to open it up. And I know we have some folks who may have submitted some questions, and I wanted to entertain questions at this time.
And I'm back, and we do have some questions. Before we get into those questions, I'm going to give people a little chance to draft some more questions, because I know how it is when you're busy listening and you're thinking at the same time. It's really hard to write also. So you actually do have a few minutes in here where you could write some questions. While you do that, I just wanted to let you know about some other opportunities that are available to you. This one that's up on your screen right now, the summit, you can see Dr. Muhammad's pictures up there. You could actually see him in person and hear a little bit more about what he has to say, and maybe go into a little bit more depth if you would like to register for the summit. And so there's that information. There's also another webinar that's coming up on February 3rd from 5 to 6, same time period. And with Ken Williams will be doing that, and it's about norms, nice to knows, or nice to knows. Dr. Muhammad spoke about professional learning communities and how that's a big piece that drives this. And this would help with getting a little bit more depth in professional learning communities. And then I told you that I would make sure to let you know about the book, Transforming School Culture. This is a book that actually, with some of what Dr. Muhammad was speaking about today, this book will help you, take you more in depth also, and has some great strategies and some immediate applications of how to make some adjustments to some of the specific points that Dr. Muhammad spoke about. Also, we have many other PLC at Work institutes throughout the summer and the fall. There's also 2-day workshops and institutes that Dr. Muhammad will be at. So this doesn't have to be the end. There's lots more that you can have access to in order to continue your learning along this line. Now, having said that, let me throw out a first question. This actually came at the kind of near the beginning of the speaking, Dr. Muhammad, and the question is, that this school is working on changing that focus on learning, or changing the focus from teaching to learning, but concerns there's still concerns from their teachers that if they don't cover all the standards, then they're not going to score high on the test. So you kind of have, both things you have to deal with.
Okay. And it sounds like what I'd like to really emphasize with that question is that the first step that I established in this, in some of the former one of the former slides, is that the first thing that the staff has to gain is philosophical consensus. What is our purpose? Our purpose is student learning. Testing, or state testing in particular, or in Canada it's provincial assessment, is just a manifestation or a measure of the learning that's taking place. If you can get on the same page that our focus is student learning, if our focus is to cover the standards and just simply cover them, and really have to establish what does that even mean. If we cover the standards and students still haven't learned, we still haven't met the mandate of our charter. So that creates a dilemma or a problem. And what do healthy cultures do? They sit down and they solve that dilemma, because it sounds like the need to comply is clashing with the need to make sure that students learn. And one thing I wanted to really emphasize is that the two don't have to be incongruent with one another. You can have students perform well on the state test and still make sure that you have a guaranteed, viable, and a curriculum that goes in depth. But we have to seek the skills and seek the processes that make that happen. So what I would suggest to the person who posed that question is to go back and really sit down with your staff and get on the same page about what is our purpose. And then Getting a collective purpose will guide your collective action. Now let's look at the standards and perhaps look at Doug Reeves' work on power standards. How do we spend more time on the must-know and less time on the nice-to-know? Covering the curriculum doesn't mean that you cover everything the same. There may be some standards that may need a few days to teach. Some may need more. But if the staff has made a decision that learning essential skills are the most important things that we do at schools, everything else now lines up around it. Stephen Covey calls it putting first things first. If you put the first things first, all those other processes will align around it. But if there's high anxiety because there's pressure and outside stress to improve student achievement, we have to first examine the best ways to improve student achievement. And driving people crazy, covering 1,000 standards in 180 days isn't the best way to raise student achievement.
All right. The next question is, what is your suggestion on dealing with toxic teachers who won't get on the bus, especially when the difficulty stems from union protection?
Okay. One, and good thing about this webinar is that I was just scratching the surface. Obviously, I just kind of described the framework. At the in the book and also at the PLC Summit, obviously go a lot deeper. But what I want leaders to really consider is that when we describe symptoms, a teacher who was resistant, here's something I want you to go back to that process that I showed you earlier. Have you diagnosed why that person behaves that way? All toxic cultures do is describe. They describe things. So if you have a teacher whose behavior is unsavory, here's a habit I want to help administrators develop. The first question I want you to consider is, why is this person behaving this way? I found 3 primary reasons in this Right and Transforming School Culture why people behave that way. Poor communication, poor support, and a lack of collaborative or nurturing environments. So ask yourself, does a person know what to do? Do they know how to do it? Do they know why they need to do it? And if you can help people understand why they behave the way they behave, they may behave better. There's a leadership theory from back in the 1950s by a researcher named Dr. McGregor, who came up with, many of you may be familiar with Theory X and Theory Y. And Theory X says that people want to do a better job, and the role of a leader is to facilitate and to make sure they have a structure and an environment in which they can do a good job. Theory Y says people by nature are lazy. They don't want to do a good job, and the role of a leader is to make them do a good job, despite their desire to do a poor job. In order to be a good administrator, especially in areas where you have strong unions, where you have others, is you'll be better off trying to build cooperation rather than trying to force people into doing something that they may legally may not have to do, but they morally and ethically and professionally need to do. So I would sit down with that person and really analyze why their behavior is the way it is. Are you communicating your goals effectively? Are they in an environment where they know what to do and they have the resources to do it? Have you developed a trusting and collaborative environment in which they can do it? And here's my premise, is that healthy cultures are balances of support and accountability. Before you can hold a person accountable, you have to first ask, have they gotten the proper support? Because my theory is that accountability is unethical if support doesn't come first. So if you eliminate all of those issues around support, and you know a person knows why they need to change their behavior and get on the bus, they know how to change their behavior, they have the resources to do it, and an environment conducive to do it, now the only thing that's left is to make them do it. And that's where force and coercion comes in. But you'd be better off building consensus with the assumption that if people know better, they can do better. And once you've built a consensus, now it becomes much easier to deal with those 1 or 2 outliers who are just being, quite frankly, jerks.
Okay. The next question. I just arrived as a curriculum facilitator in a district where change is not welcome, and the PLCs are centered just around the tested areas. And the question is, in order to make change happen, would it be better to address a bigger issue like what is a PLC, or to focus on something like like grading practices?
Well, it's kind of like the chicken and the egg argument. I would suggest you do both simultaneously. But the first thing, and I don't want to keep beating a dead horse, but Peterson was very clear, and my years of practice and research have taught me that building philosophical consensus is important. Obviously, it sounds like in this district there are different philosophies about the importance of non-academic areas, and there's difference in philosophy about how many resources, how much emphasis should be placed on it. Before you can get people to use new practices and new technical tools, they have to first be on the same page philosophically. So, sounds like the person who asked this question is very clear about why he or she wants to see the change take place. Here's a question I'd like to throw back. Are those who you're trying to influence, do they have the same level of commitment and comprehension that you do? If they don't, you'd be wasting your time trying to talk about PLC or anything else until you first build that shared focus, that shared vision. So I would suggest you go back and do that first. And then here's what we've learned from Larry Lazat, is that when school cultures become healthy, they seek the tools or policies or procedures they need to achieve that end. So you don't start with the tools first and then try and change people's mind. You deal with the focus, commitment, and professional culture first. And then those folks will seek those tools to help validate what they say they collectively believe in.
You know, that actually leads really nicely into this next question, because the next question is, how do you assess that the change that you have been working on and hoping is happening, how do you really know that it's happening?
You have to measure it. Whenever you implement a new policy or practice or procedure, it's built right into the SMART goal template, is that it has to be results oriented. So if you hire a new truancy officer, if we want to evaluate the effectiveness of that new change, I would obviously measure how many more students are coming to school. So if you're trying to improve reading by implementing Read 180 or some other reading strategy, the way that you validate that is to measure. So in the second part of that development of healthy culture, it was data analysis and measure. We have to look at our brutal facts, which lets us know where we need to improve. And then when we try a new experiment, we have to monitor that experiment through whatever measuring point that we've chosen to analyze to know whether that change is effective or not. So I've worked with schools who spent thousands of dollars on reading coaches. And then we look at the data and find that the students aren't reading any better now than they were before they had $300,000 worth of reading coaches. So it would probably make sense that before you went out and hired reading coaches, you set a goal for improvement and then have those reading coaches work towards the accomplishment of that measurable and tangible goal. But if you remove those elements, don't be shocked if people are confused about the effectiveness of what they're being asked to do.
Okay. You know, I'm actually going to combine a couple of questions because it kind of does the opposite about assessing the changes that have happened. The one question is, what would you recommend would be a first approach to a toxic school? And then along with that, we have a question that said, how would a new administrator be able to build trust within a toxic school?
Yeah, great question. And in transforming school culture, we identify trust as one of the impediments to getting people to cooperate and get on the bus. And for a new administrator, one of the things you may face is that a lot of the distrust that may exist among staff members has nothing to do with you because you weren't even there. So you're dealing with a history of bad leadership, and you're dealing with the residue of what other people have done before you. So don't be shocked if it takes the folks who may be a little gun shy a little bit of time to trust you, even though you may be acting in a trustworthy fashion. But I'm going to go back again to this first step. Have the new person coming on a campus that's very toxic, can you help your staff develop a collective vision? When that isn't done, if you have 50 staff members, they are operating off of 50 independent and different paradigms about what they think the collective purpose of the organization is. So How do you get 50 people to see your students and the goals of your organization similar? You have some teachers who don't allow late homework, some who do. Why? Because they have different philosophies about education. Can you build a consensus among your staff that this is our purpose, this is our charter, this is our mandate? That's the first goal or the first component of developing a healthy culture. The second is this. Once you've developed that consensus, now you need to look at a review of your data and your policies and procedures and practices and ask, do your policies and practices and procedures match what you say you believe in? So once you kind of shoot your mouth like Muhammad Ali did, saying you're going to knock somebody out in the 5th round, now you have to actually go out and do it. But until you can set that goal collectively, it really makes no sense to go back and plan for something that hasn't been defined. Define what you're about, define where you're trying to go, and then have people build capacity around how do we develop the policies and procedures and practices that support what we say we're about.
Okay. We also had a couple of questions, so I'm going to kind of try to put them together, about task overload. And that sometimes it's just a fact. There's teachers are doing too much, but don't really know how to lessen their load. Are there still ways to move them forward?
Yeah. I would ask a question. How is task overload working for you? Just because you make people do a lot of things doesn't mean they're going to do it well. It may be worth trying the best you can as an administrator to reduce some of the load that teachers may have on their plate. Rick DeFore talks about, in many occasions, talking about what we need to stop doing.
Okay, I lost Anthony. I don't know if other people lost him too. If you can still hear me, I'll move on to the next question, and we'll see if we can find you. And if not, then we'll just kind of wrap this up. But the last, well, actually we had a whole bunch of questions, but there was another question that a lot of people seem to ask, and that was still about the resistors. Even when you think you're moving forward in a toxic culture, if there's resistors, how do you pull them on board? But I'm thinking maybe we've lost contact with Anthony. Let me try something here real quick. Yep, I don't see him. So I apologize for the quick end to the webinar. We really were at the end of our time anyway. But I will give you some more information on how to be able to contact us. I already mentioned the Solution Tree website, solution-tree.com. You can find information from Anthony on that website, and you can, so there's all kinds of ways that you can have contact with him. There's a slide up here right now that gives you phone numbers. If you call them, I guarantee you'll talk to a nice person that would love to help you as you further your work. If there's anything that we can do in regard to text resources or professional development, we've got some really quality work out there. Also, you can follow us on Facebook and YouTube and TeacherTube and Twitter. So there's lots of ways to access this information. And I want to remind you again that this webinar will be available to you, and you'll get an email as a reminder that you can get onto the recorded email or the recorded webinar and be sure and review pieces of it. If you don't have your questions answered and there's something that you just really need assistance with, by all means, please go back to the phone numbers or call Solution Tree, and we'll be glad to help you answer your questions, because we love it when schools are moving their work forward. Thank you very much for your attendance today, and we appreciate having you and hope you'll participate in some of our upcoming webinars. Thank you and good night.